This presentation is dedicated to my dad, Shocky Strand. It's his World War II story. He never talked much about the war, but we know quite a bit from his ship cruise book, because the cruise book is, he was on the ship from the time it was commissioned to the time it was decommissioned. This cruise book created by guys on the ship, and it's a diary and it's photographs. We never got to look at this much because there was a chest, all this stuff was in, and don't touch that. So it took me a long time to realize what was actually in that diary. And by putting that together, his photos, his stories, the internet, you can actually come up with a pretty good story. Again, this war, World War II is two wars. The war in Europe, which is a ground war, and the war in the Pacific, which is a sea and air war. And actually two enemies, the Germans on that side, the Japanese, and rarely did they intersect. Shocky's war is the war in Japan, so his war is the Pacific War. This war is bookended by two really controversial events. The first one is executed by the Japanese, and that's the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And the second bookend event is executed by the Americans, and that is the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So let's start our story. At about 6 o'clock on December 7th, 1941, 6 carriers, Japanese fleet, pulled within striking distance of Pearl Harbor. They launched 350 planes in 2 waves, and they basically took out 8 battleships, 10 other ships, 250 planes, all was burning and sinking in the harbor. About 3,581 people lost their lives that day, half of them from the USS Arizona. And they are still entombed in the USS Arizona to this day. You can go to Pearl Harbor and actually see that. It's a grave site. By 7:40, all this stuff is burning in the harbor. In a broader perspective, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a failure for the Japanese. I mean, that's when you look at it historically. What was lost there, or what was damaged, was battleships. And this would not be a battleship war. This would be a carrier and aircraft war. So it was a failure for 3 reasons. The battleships were not that important to the war in the Pacific. And some of them were as old as 1912. And many of them were repaired and brought back into service. So that didn't work. That plan didn't work so good. The casualty list was small by World War II standards. And Tokyo had calculated that if they attacked the Americans, we would sue for peace quickly. And they were wrong. The Americans were electrified, and they were going to fight to the death. So that really didn't work for them. The other thing I wanted to, I'll come back to that. The next day, December 8th, 1941, Roosevelt goes in front of a joint session of Congress. He says 2 famous things. December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy. And, the other thing he says is, as of December 7th, 1941, the United States is in a state of war with the Empire of Japan. They voted on war, and only 1 dissenting vote. So we are now at war with Japan. The other point I want to make is the Japanese, within hours and days of Pearl Harbor, they also attacked the Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong. They conquered Guam, Wake Island, Borneo, Java, Malaysia, the Solomons, the Marianas, Burma, and the Dutch West Indies. So they took the whole Pacific within hours and days. And it would take the U.S. quite a while to come back. On December 10th, 1941, Hitler also declares war on the U.S. So though we had tried to stay out of the war in Europe, we are now in 100%. Hitler calculated that the Japanese have not lost a war in 3,000 years. So if I ally myself with them, I can't lose. So that was his plan. For Shocky, we're going to talk about this guy first and then Shocky. So what were the Japanese thinking? This is Admiral Yamamoto. He is the architect of Pearl Harbor. And he was thinking that if I quickly take out the Americans, we're good. But he also says something famous. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, he says, I fear all we have done is awaken the sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. And he was right. He was exactly right. Yamamoto will not survive the war. 2 years later, they intercept a message, the U.S. intercepts a message that he's going to visit his troops in the South Pacific. They shoot down his plane in Bougainville, and you can see on the internet the still decaying remnants of his plane. So that's interesting, I think. So for Shocky is a sophomore at Concordia. These are pictures of him on the football team. He was a 3-star athlete. He's in the Hall of Fame over at Concordia. And this is a family photo also taken in 1941. So there are people in the crowd that will recognize some people here. There's Ardell. So she's from Mayville, so she knows some of these people. So for people Shocky's age, 18 to 22, going into the war was pretty inevitable. It was a matter of which branch and when you went in. He would, let's see. In the fall of 1942, he would go back to school at Concordia as a junior, and he would go into the admissions office. And the admissions office would help him enlist in a program called the V7 program. The V7 program was put on by the Navy, and I think each of those programs was centered out of one university. I think V7 was centered out of Northwestern. Another famous person was in a program similar to this, a V12 program, centered out of Harvard, Yale, and that was President John F. Kennedy. That's how he got into the war. Also a program like this. They went over athletes because athletes were physically fit and they knew chain of command. They knew the coach tells you to do something, you do it. Officer tells you to do something, you do it. So 70% of the people who went into these programs were athletes. So Shocky was well suited to this. Concordia put him in. He credits them with saving his life because unlikely he would have gone in as a high status as he actually did. The picture of the dentist is there. That's his writing on the side, his little summary of what he did. The dentist is there because when he took his physical, Portland, North Dakota dentists would pull your teeth instead of filling them. So he didn't have as many teeth as they thought he should have. So he almost didn't get in for that reason. It's kind of interesting. And in order to fill requirements to get into this program, they kept upping the requirements. He needed to go to the University of Minnesota and take math classes in the summer of 1943. And then he would graduate in the winter of 1944, and he would be on his way to Plattsburgh, New York for Navy training. George figured out, he got into this last summer. My dad left from Cummings, North Dakota railway station. He made his own way there, he told George. And George went and investigated. This is a house that was the old railway station. That's where he would have left from. When he was in Plattsburgh, New York, he would have gone there by train. It was about 12 weeks of training. He would have become a midshipman and also an ensign in the Navy in about 12 weeks. And then he would get 4 days of leave in Portland, North Dakota. So these are Shocky's photos. They're not so good, but that's Shocky in Portland. The other photo, I believe that my grandparents may have gone to the commissioning of the ship because it's different coats, different era, but I've never figured that out. And then he was already assigned to be a landing barge officer. He was on his way to Coronado, California for what they called amphibious training. And on his way there, he would stop in Glendale, California to visit his brother, who was already working at Lockheed. He had his whole family at Lockheed in Glendale, and Shocky says he stopped. His brother picked him up with a glass of cold water, and his sister-in-law washed his clothes, and he played with the 2 little blonde-headed girls before he went off to San Diego. And he was there 16 weeks. Whenever he got a chance, he was going up to visit them. And there were a lot of people from Mayville, Portland, who were going to visit them. I've heard other names. And then he would go off to Coronado, California, off San Diego, and he would start practicing assaults on Pacific beaches. So he would be a landing barge officer, all the things, landing the barges, putting them out to sea, dropping the bow door, picking up the wounded, all these things they would practice for about 16 weeks. And then we know that, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Higgins boats. These are called Higgins boats, or LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. And always the Marines, Army would shorten these names. So this was often called, for the P on the end, the Peter boat. LCMs were called the Mike boat. They shortened the names because they were hard to keep those initials together. These boats, they made about 20,500 of these boats in the war. They were made by the Higgins Industries in Louisiana, New Orleans, Louisiana, originally designed for the swamps, but the Navy customized them to have that bow door that would drop, and they bought, like I said, 20,000. They were not made of metal, they were made of wood because of saving materials for the war. So they weren't very safe. They had a curved bottom, so they would call these boats, the nickname was the continuous lean, because you couldn't stand up straight in them very easily. There were 3 people that would operate this barge, 2 gunners in those circular turrets there, and 1 person, the driver, they'd call the coxswain. And coxswain, for my relatives, I said, this is a Norse word. It's Norwegian. Cock for cockboat, a boat that rides on another boat, and swain, master, small boat master. This is a Norwegian word. And they would shorten it and say coxswain, coxswain. And Shocky even shortened it to say cox. That's my cox. I figured out as we're going through this, the landing barges would carry 36 men to the beach. And it could also carry a 2.5 ton Jeep to the beach. And there's a picture of the gunners. There would be 2 of those. And there's a landing barge going out. This I found on the internet this spring. Shocky's ship will be PA 157. And all of a sudden, I've been looking for this, a landing barge from PA 157. This barge is going to Iwo Jima. It's from his ship because it's coded 157, and this is 15, I think. So this could be Shocky, but it's certainly somebody Shocky knows driving this barge. So that was very interesting to me. We know on October 1, he was up in Astoria, Oregon for the commissioning of his ship. This is his ship, the USS Napa, APA 157. It says in the Napa log that the 10 or 11 people trained separately in Coronado Island reported for duty at 5 o'clock in the commissioning of the ship. And I just want to tell you a little bit about these ships. They built 117 of these attack transports in 1944, and they went into commission 44 and 45. They're called the Haskell-style ships. They're built in the Victory program. And Shocky's ship was an attack transport. Basically what it would do is transport 1,500 troops throughout the Pacific. There's Shocky. Those are the 11 men that were trained in Coronado. Shocky is there. His best friend and roommate for the entire war is DeWitt T. Ray from Dallas, Texas, from a very wealthy family. They were best buddies. This is the officers being reviewed. That's Mrs. William Cranston naming the ship. And the ship is, most of these ships were named for counties in the U.S. So USS Napa is named for Napa County, California. And then I just wanted to show you what the ship looks like inside. And we'll review some of the crew. There is a movie about the attack transports. It's called Away All Boats. This guy actually wrote a book, and it became a movie. So you can look at that movie. You can see everything that these attack transports look like. So this is the movie star. This is what their 2-bed room would have looked like. This is Shocky and DeWitt T. Ray. You see the bunk up there? Shocky would always say, I could ask for a sandwich anywhere on the ship, and it would be brought to me by a steward. And they were black. This was racially segregated ship. I visited the USS Wisconsin. This is the ward room, and it kind of acted as the room that they ate in, but also as a business center. They hung out there. The button on the end, the USS Napa would have had that too. That button rings the stewards, and they come up. And you can see they had it pretty nice, the officers. They even have silver tea service here in the wardroom. And these are photos. These are Shocky's photos. Again, they're not so nice. I'll work on them a bit to see. But here he's in the wheelhouse, the 40mm gun. That's Shocky. Here he's at the manning winch. Here's on the wing of the bridge. So, and then what was it like for the enlisted men? The enlisted men could be, they would transport either Navy or either Marines or Army. But they would be 1,500 men stacked 5 high on 30-inch wide bunks with all their belongings hanging on the side. This is basically the way they were transported. So not luxury. Shocky would say the worst job on the ship was painting. There are guys who painted and sanded the entire war. They just continued going around the ship painting and sanding. And he said this was the worst job. So that's a bit about the ship. After it was commissioned, it went up to Seattle, Washington for its maiden voyage, and then it would drop down to California. 4 places it went in California, kind of loading, unloading, moving things around. We know that it went to San Francisco first. They stopped in San Francisco. They were there 8 hours, and they loaded their landing barges, and it says Chris Craft assault boats. And then they moved down to the rest of California, and they would go to San Pedro, they would go to San Diego. And the last place they left from was Port Hueneme. And they left for Pearl Harbor from Port Hueneme, and they loaded the 33rd Seabees. And the Seabees are the Navy construction arm. They would go and rebuild the airfields that had been bombed by people, by Japanese or Americans. They would set up the beach, set down metal meshing. Here's where the storage is, here's where the fuel is, here's where the supplies are. That was the job of the Seabees. And Shocky always greatly admired the Seabees. He would shake his head and go, oh, those Seabees. And I never really knew why, but I think you'll learn a bit why. On December 2nd, 1941, they would head to Pearl Harbor. They would arrive there on December 21st. The Napa log says they arrived and the sunken USS Utah was very near their fleet landing. So they saw the effects of Pearl Harbor, and they were there till the 21st, so very near Christmas of 1944. One thing I want to interject here is no enemy of the Americans has ever been hated as much as the Japanese. And I have checked this with people of this era. They were hated more than the British in the Revolutionary War, more than the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, more than the Germans in World War I. Why? Well, first reason was the attack on Pearl Harbor, unforgivable, dastardly deed. Number 2 was their fanaticism. Most American military people believed you could do nothing with the Japanese but just kill them. They would not surrender. They had done things like the Bataan and Corregidor death marches. They knew that they would do seppuku, commit ritual suicide. They had bonsai attacks where they would do a mass suicide attack. And at the end of the war, they had kamikaze attacks where they would put a pilot into a plane and just fly it into a ship. So these things, their fanaticism, Americans didn't really understand. And the third thing, racism. Those other enemies look like us. We didn't really understand Asians and Japanese. Okay, so when they are in, they move from Pearl Harbor over to Maui and Sand Island. That's where they will practice, again, all the maneuvers to attack an island in the Pacific. Maui was the home of the 4th Marines. They call them the Maui Marines. And the Maui Marines are also the Marines that lost their flag in Bataan and Corregidor. At the end of the war, the 4th Marines will have lost 75% of their men. It's an amazing group of men. And here you see all the attack transports. They're all there lined up and they're practicing all of the things, making foxholes, landing in the barges, all the things they will do at the beach. And they will practice there till the 27th of January. We have a daycare here, big daycare. Before we head out to the Pacific from Pearl Harbor, I just want to talk about Shocky's route in general. The war in the south of the Pacific is over by this time. It's Central and Northern Pacific that he's going to be involved in. The first place they come to is Eniwetok. And Eniwetok, most Americans would never have heard of because it was a floating base and it was a secret, basically a secret. They had several of these because they could not take the ships back to Hawaii. It's too far. So the Navy figured out we can set up these mobile bases and we will keep moving it. As we move to Japan, we will keep moving these mobile bases. And there were 700 to 900 ships in these mobile bases. So this is one. Ulithi is another one. They will go to the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. They will go to Iwo Jima. They will go to Okinawa. They will go to Formosa or Taiwan. They will go in China to Shanghai and Qingdao. And they will go to Manila. They will go to Manila and Leyte in the Philippines. And they will go all the way over to French Indochina or Vietnam. So that's a story we're going to tell. About the 27th of January, they head out to sea. About a week out to sea, a Captain Mustang comes over the intercom system and he says, "Men, we will be attacking Iwo Island in the volcano chains. Our assignment will be Blue Beach." And that is all. And the Napa log says, "And we knew the rest." So this is where they're heading. They stop here first, February 5 to 7. They're in this place called Eniwetok, the floating base. It's a sunken volcano, so what you're seeing is the rim of the volcano. And the Navy and the Seabees figured out we can put 700 to 900 ships inside there. Everything we need will be in there. Clothes, fuel, ammunition, everything. They even had, the kids were like this, an ice cream ship. They did. And they will stop here. They're probably bringing supplies and they're taking supplies, and they're going to head off from here to Saipan. This is Saipan. Saipan is Iwo Jima, where they are heading now, is halfway between Saipan and Japan. This is famous in Saipan. It's called Marpi Point. When Saipan was taken, many of the Japanese soldiers and many of the civilians jumped off Marpi Point, committed suicide. This too was unbelievable to Americans. They could watch mothers with their babies jumping off this cliff. They believed that the Japanese had told them that the Americans were going to do terrible things to them, and that's what they did. So in Saipan, they are also practicing. They are here from 11 to the 16th. Napalog says they practiced on Saipan, but when you read history, they also practiced on Tinian. Tinian is 1.5 miles away, and it is very famous for an airfield. It was taken because of an airfield, and we'll talk about that airfield later. So I think Shocky probably practiced on both of those. Then on February 16th, Napa will join a task force. And this task force is 495 ships. 495 ships. I've never found a picture of it. This is a picture of another task force. This task force is going from Ulithi to the Philippines, but it would have looked similar to this. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, we only had 2 carriers, and they were out to sea. Luckily, they were out to sea. By 1943, we only had 3. But look at this. This is 1945, and there are 5 or 6 in front of this task force going out. And it would have been similar going to Iwo Jima. Here we can see, this is a summary of the ships going to Iwo Jima. There were 43 attack transports. So almost half of the attack transports were going to Iwo Jima. Then let's talk a little bit about the island of Iwo Jima. I took these photos actually at the World War II Memorial to get these names. This is the island. They always talk about it as shaped like a pork chop, and that it basically is. It was valuable because the Japanese had built 2 airfields there, and they were building a 3rd one. And the Americans could get their bombers to Japan without fueling them, but they could not get the escort planes to Japan and bomb without having this island. This island is, Iwo means sulfur. It smells of rotten eggs. There's almost no vegetation on this island. It's sand, it's volcanic sand. There's almost no people living on here, only a little fishing village. Where these ships are heading, they're going to be in the waters outside here. They're going to land on this beach. The 4th Marines will remain with the USS Napa to this battle, and the 5th Marines are assigned the area of the beach closest to Mount Suribachi. There are 2 high points on this island, Mount Suribachi, the old dormant volcano, and right here, the quarry. And Shocky would call this the cliff because he never saw inside the quarry, he only saw outside. So the lower part near Suribachi, their assignment, the 5th Marines, was to cut across this narrow part of the island and cut off Suribachi. That was their assignment on the first day. For the 4th Marines, they were to go in and take that airfield, and that they were supposed to do on the first day. Shocky's assignment, we'll probably go over this again, was Blue Beach 2. His assignment was closest to the quarry, called it the cliff. There's also only one little harbor in Iwo Jima, this East Boat Basin, and we'll talk a bit more about that. This is what the island looked like. The island was so hot, if you dug a foxhole, it was hot. If you wanted to cook your food, you could actually heat it by digging down into the soil and catching that. So you see it steaming. There was so much sand and buildup on the beach, it was very hard for the equipment to move. It got bogged down. And you can see they can't dig a foxhole down very far. Now we're going to move. We're going to leave those 495 ships outside Iwo Jima, and we're going to talk about what the Japanese are doing. This guy, Lieutenant General Kiribayashi, is who they're going to meet at Iwo Jima. Kiribayashi was, he went to college in Canada. He was an attaché to the U.S. for 2 years. He would draw pictures of the U.S. for his son. And he always said, this is a country we should not fight. They have a lot of industrial power. His family was a samurai warrior family. They were 6 generations serving the emperor. When he was assigned to Iwo Jima, he was assigned by Tojo, the prime minister. When the Marianas were lost, everybody, Tojo and his whole cabinet resigned. They basically, many people thought the war was over at that point. But Kiribayashi was still going to Iwo Jima. He left his ceremonial sword with his brother, his family. He knew he was never coming back from this place. When he got to the island, there were summer of 44, there were 1,500 Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima. But in the time from that summer to the battle, February 1945, they would build that up to 21,000. They brought them from Korea, they brought them from China. And he believed in, when he got there, there's kind of a moving around of equipment on Iwo Jima. There was the two generals went there that eventually committed seppuku in the Marianas, and one of them was called Tamara, and he had a strategy of Tamara's sword, put all the defenses on the beach, and that did not work well in the Marianas. Kiribayashi wanted all those defenses that were now on the beach, because those generals ordered it, moved in. So he moved them in. And then the Navy came and said, we're going to give you 350 guns, but we want them on the beach. So Kiribayashi's lieutenant says, well, how did that work for you in the Marianas? Very sarcastically. So they said, okay, no guns for you. And Kiribayashi came in and mediated and said, okay, half in and half out. I'll give you 1,000 men to build them in on the beach, and that settled that. Kiribayashi would also use that ash to make concrete and to build tunnels inside Iwo Jima. Some of the soldiers would say the Americans were fighting on top of the island and the Japanese were fighting inside the island. They would build 16 miles of tunnels. The only place they never got connected, because they had planned 17 miles with Suribachi, was never connected. Inside those tunnels, some of them were 7 stories high. I'll show you pictures of Okinawa's tunnels later. Most of these destroyed. And what were they doing out in those ships? They were probably ever since they left Hawaii, they're doing this kind of instruction. You see the pork chop there. This guy is instructing his troops. And there's Shocky's note. From the summer of 1944 on, they would bomb Iwo Jima for 72 days. But this did not do much because they still were building the tunnels. Before the attack, the Marines, this was a Marine battle, almost 100% Marines. The Navy was outside in the sea. The Marines wanted 10 days of bombardment from sea before they went in. The Navy said, no, we can only give you 3 because you're not priority. Bombing of Japan, bombing of Okinawa take priority, and we'll give you 3. The Marine says they put on a good face, and because of weather, they got 18 hours of bombing of Iwo Jima before the landing. This is a map. There were actually 700 identified installations on Iwo Jima that they could see from the air. And because of only 18 hours of bombing, only about 20 were taken out. No island in the Pacific was attacked, with many of installations that they knew about still in place. And from the air, they couldn't see what was inside the island. There's a lot more inside the island. So this was a situation the Marines were facing. The other thing that happened before the attack is these gunboats went along the beach, and they were looking for mines. And they brought in underwater divers. The Japanese thought this is the main attack. So they attacked these gunboats and greatly damaged the gunboats. About 170 divers died on this day. And by the time they first started at Suribachi, this is Suribachi, by the time they got to Shocky's end of the island, the gunboats were so damaged they had to bring in other ships. But they did not find many mines. And then we're going to talk about, this is Shocky's position, Blue Beach 2, near the quarry. This is what the quarry looks like inside, actually. And it was also a very bloody battle for that quarry. This might have been taken before he got on his landing barge to go to Iwo Jima. Once he got on the landing barge, he never got off. For 5 days, he was on the landing barge. He would have eaten cold food. He would have probably barely slept. Probably had a chamber pot to drop over the side. They would stay on that barge. And this is number 10. This is the one I told you about before. This is from USS Napa. Could be Shocky, but somebody he knew, actually. Okay, so their ships are outside. At 3 o'clock, all of the men are called to what they call a battle breakfast. Battle breakfast is steak and eggs. So if they could eat on the ships, they were having steak and eggs. Then they would load into their landing barges. This is the lowering and the loading of the landing barges. The Marines would be lining up. They would go down nets 4 at a time. And by 6 o'clock, they're pretty much loading these barges. This is from the movie. So you can see what's happening. The barges pull up, the troops come down. Those troops are carrying 50 to 75 pounds on their back. If they fall between the ship and the landing barge, probably not going to get you out. And that did happen. When they got in the water, they would circle like this. This is also from the movie, so you can learn how this all happened. On the 4 corners of the ship, they would circle, and they would go clockwise and counterclockwise each side. So if they hit each other, they would bounce off. So this is all trying to get lined up to go to the beach. And this is actually Shocky's coxswain, Dutton. And we debate, what did Shocky do? And he would often be interviewed for the reunions, and then you'd read, the text would be written out in the reunion book. And he always said, I led the wave to Blue Beach 2. And so I'm looking at this, I thought he was a driver, so I said, no, he's not the coxswain. He is the fourth man on the boat. Some of those, I think only a few of them had a fourth man. He's calling the signals. And when he says, I led from the movies, this is what he was doing. Here's the waves going in. The first wave, at 8:30, they're all lined up and they're heading to the beach. The signal goes off, they're going in. They are 5 minutes apart. So the first wave goes in, it's mostly equipment, and all that equipment is bogging down in the sand. The tracks are coming off, they're going in sideways, it's a big mess. And then, 5 minutes apart, the troops are still coming in. On that day, they will land 30,000 men. Here you can see some of that, they're just going sideways, the plan was, Kiribachi was not going to attack the beach. He was going to let them come on. But because of this buildup, at about an hour later, Shocky arrived on the beach, he says 19 minutes after the battle started. Well, at 10 o'clock, Kiribachi will open fire. He will open fire from the two high points, the quarry and Mount Suribachi. And all of these men will be caught in the crossfire. So that day was the worst day. Some of the soldiers or journalists said men died with the greatest possible violence on the beach here. Many of the Seabees who would be first to go in were not taught to fight. They were supposed to sit at the beach, and they suffered a lot of tragedy too. Eventually the men would have to manhandle themselves the supplies to the beach because the equipment was not working first day. What Shocky's assignment would be to take 36 men in and then to take the wounded out. My cousin tells a story about Shocky would go through the water and lift the heads of the men to see who was still breathing. If you lost your life on Iwo Jima, you stayed. If you were still alive, you were taken off. And you were taken off like this, by the landing barge. 5 men laying down, could be more if you were sitting up. And then you were put on these platforms and you were taken to the hospital ship. Iwo Jima is just going to go through. This is the layout of Iwo Jima. There's Blue Beach 2, and this is the departure line. And then the ships would sit in these transport areas. So that's kind of the layout outside Iwo Jima. Okay, after that first day, the weather deteriorates as the first day goes on badly. And sometime, I don't know, first, second day, Blue Beach 2 is closed. It is so bad, it is closed. And they double up on Blue Beach 1. I think Green Beach near Suribachi was always doubled up. So Shocky had one of the worst positions, beach. He says that the landing barge next to him in one of these trips to the beach took a direct hit and it was out. It was gone, completely gone. And I'm thinking about this later going, if you were standing up there going like this, do you think they were aiming at the next landing barge? I think they were aiming at you. And I think Shocky probably knew that, but it just dawned on me, like, they would have aimed at the guy calling the shots. But this is just a conjecture on my part. This is what the beach started to look like. After the first day, the 3rd Marines reserves were called in because of what was happening on the beach. And we know that Shocky's ship, the USS Napa, was one of those that moved into the inner harbor to bring in the 3rd Marines. Because Martha McCallum, CNN newscaster, wrote a story about her uncle who died on Iwo Jima. And she mentioned specifically Napa as one of the 5 ships bringing in men. But the problem on the 20th, the next day, the 20th, the weather greatly deteriorated. They loaded the 3rd Marines, they circled. Some made it to the beach, some did not. Some were reloaded to the ships. Also that day, the Japanese were planning kamikaze attacks. They parked at another island, they reloaded fuel, and they were coming on to Iwo Jima. But because of weather, they turned back. So 20th was a good and a bad day. 2 things happen on the 21st. On the 21st, the kamikazes do come on. The kamikazes sink the Bismarck Sea, and they greatly damaged the USS Saratoga and other ships. So that was a bad day. I'm sure in the harbor you heard all of that going on. The other thing that happened is about midnight, Napa is in the inner waters. they talk about this midnight time in the Napa log, and then at 4:44, Napa sees white and green running lights coming towards it. Navigator moves to avoid, cannot, and Napa is rammed by the USS Logan, a similar attack transport, and it cuts a 15-foot gash in Napa's side. It takes out the coolers, it takes out some of the medical facilities, it takes out the meat lockers, and USS Logan pulls alongside for about 30 minutes, tries to get it stable. Some of the men that were going to be loading its ships, the 3rd Marines, are now helping. They're filling the holds with water. Those holds with water have oil on top of them, and they're trying to take casualties off, and they finally get Napa stable. It had listed 10 degrees. They finally get it stable. The USS Estes comes alongside, takes Napa out to the outer waters with about 7 escort ships. And so Napa remains at Iwo Jima. Amazingly enough, it remains. There's the USS Logan. It only hurt like the front end and crumpled it of the USS Logan. And these are the transports. So here's Napa and Transport 44, Logan and 45. I don't know what happened to this guy. He probably was in some pretty big trouble. But there were a lot of rammings because there were just so many ships in the harbor there. What happened, I don't know if you guys know about, probably young ones don't, there was broadcasters from Tokyo, and the broadcaster from Tokyo was a woman. There were 7 of the women who filled this role. They broadcast from Tokyo, they played American music to attract the troops to listen to them, and then they would talk about what their girlfriends and wives were doing back in the US. They're messing around with the guys that didn't go to the war. And the Japanese are waiting for you on Iwo. And the other thing she said is, attack transport Napa sunk as the ruined enemy fleet panics. So troops are listening to this. Shocky's out in the harbor, and what he hears is Napa is sunk. So for I don't know how long, he thought his ship had sunk, but that was cleared up later. Okay, so we were at 21st is when that happened. 22nd, Napa log is silent. Somehow they missed that day, it got omitted. But it was the same. Troops in, wounded out, troops in, wounded out. On the 23rd, this famous thing happened. There was a colonel on the beach, Colonel Chandler Johnson. He sent 40 of his Marines up to the top of Mount Suribachi with a historic flag. I forget where this came from. It might have come from Pearl Harbor. Sent them up there. He said, get this flag up there. They posted the flag on a water pipe. And then Department of the Navy Forrestal was on the beach. I can't imagine this high-powered guy was on the beach. He saw the flag and he said, that flag means the Marines will last 500 more years. I want that flag. And Colonel Johnson heard about that and said, no, you're not getting that flag. I'm going to find another flag. So they took a bigger flag up there and they had this exchange, and huge controversy over this, whether the photographer staged it, who was in the photograph. You can read about all of that. This is the famous statue outside Arlington Cemetery. This is a thing that Admiral Nimitz said about Iwo Jima. Uncommon valor was a common virtue. And they post the battles. So the Marine battles are there. It's holy ground for the Marines. I live in Washington, D.C. You go by there, they are always there, doing something, marching, singing, something. Okay, so now we are at the 24th of February. All of the landing barges are called out of the water, back to their ships. This part of the battle is over. They now have hospitals on the island, and they're not landing troops like this anymore. 70,000 are there on the beach. And 3 journalists ride back with Napa to Guam. This journalist, one from Harper's, one from Reader's Digest, and one from Central Chinese News Agency. And I've looked up what they wrote. It's very interesting because it's firsthand. Also, going back to Guam, there will be a burial at sea. One of the casualties dies, and he is buried at sea on the way to Guam. And Shocky, in his later years, would always cry about this too. Because I believe he was one of these too. I took a magnifying glass. I know he's not these, and I know he's not these. He's one of these. So what they would do is, if you died on the ship, they could not keep your body, especially now their refrigeration is all out. They would take the body. You would be wrapped in your duffel bag, basically your sheets and stuff. It served dual purpose. They would put a flag on top. They would tilt this, and they would keep the flag, send the flag to the family. So that's what happened on the way back to Guam. And recapping the conclusions of Iwo Jima, I just want to go through this. This is the kamikaze attack. And here, by mistake, they list Napa. Napa was actually friendly, but they, by mistake, listed here, and we all know that's not right. But you find these things when you're digging around. Also, the 4th Marines and the 5th Marines had a hospital ship when they went to Iwo Jima. They knew what was going to happen here, and they each had a cemetery. So there were big cemeteries on Iwo Jima, 4th Marines and 5th Marines, by the end of this battle. The Americans would have 26 casualties and 6,800 dead. The Japanese would lose almost their entire division, 18,844. 216 would be captured, 1,000 would hide and eventually be caught. This is the only battle of the Pacific where the Americans had more casualties and deaths than the Japanese, total. Okay, now they reach Guam. It says in an epilogue the journalists got off, the casualties got off, the ambulances were lined up as far as the eye could see, but the crew was very anxious to get off because they wanted to see the gash in the side. And they got off. This is how it looked. The harbor people said when they saw the gash in the side, do not move that ship, because I think they were afraid this ship would sink in the harbor. Eventually they got it pulled over to dry dock and it started to be repaired. It was in Guam from the 28th to the 25th. So what they would do in Guam, they would load prisoners of war. So they would load Japanese prisoners and American casualties, and they would go back to Pearl Harbor. I always think this is so ironic. You bomb Pearl Harbor, and now you're going to serve as a prisoner of war in Pearl Harbor. And these are all the soldiers. This looks like a woman to me, but I never did get that story straight. I only have one story from my dad from this trip. He says one guy approached him, and he spoke in clear English and said, I'm an American. I have an American citizenship. And I was in Japan on vacation. They put me in the military, but I'm an American citizen. So my dad goes to tell the captain, there's an American citizen in this prisoner of war. And the captain says, I don't care. He's going back. This is not our job. He's going back to Hawaii. So that guy got no reprieve. Anyways, as they are traveling here on their way, on the 1st of April, 1945, the Battle of Iwo Jima, or Okinawa, starts. So I always wonder, well, what would have happened to Napa if it hadn't been rammed? So I went to look at what happened to USS Logan. Where did USS Logan go? USS Logan was at the start of the Battle of Okinawa. They were in the decoy beach. They had troops on board. They were on the decoy side. And after the 3rd day, they started landing. I believe that Napa would have been with Logan at the start of the Battle of Okinawa. But again, Shocky gets a reprieve. As they are in Hawaii, President Roosevelt dies. He dies on the 12th of April, 1945. This is his 4th term. He's in the 3rd month of his 4th term, and he dies. This was tragic because most Americans didn't know any other president. They didn't really like Truman, but now Truman is in the presidency. On Hawaii, did I flash by the Pink Hotel? I did. Shocky talks about the Pink Hotel. The officers would get some leave at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, and he had a picture on the Waikiki Beach. So they did try to keep these guys, somewhat, what do you want to say? Just not completely beaten down. And he would meet up with his Concordia friends. This is Shocky and his Concordia friends. That's Shocky. They would go to the rodeo. That's Shocky. So they did get some breaks, but they will. We're going faster on these trips now. From Hawaii, they would go to Seattle to pick up the U.S. Army troops, and they would come back to Hawaii, and then they would go to Enewetak, we already talked about, and then they would go to Ulithi. So now the mobile base is moving. Mobile base is Ulithi, and they will arrive there. They set up this similar, the Seabees will set up a R&R area, rest and relaxation, called Mogmog Island. And I'll show you Mogmog Island. Shocky would talk about this little part of that island. This is the officers' area. This is troops arriving. They could go to the Mogmog Island from about 1 to 6, and then they would be called off the island. So again, it was rest and relaxation. It says that they did the 4 Bs there: beach, boxing, baseball, and beer. They will leave Ulithi, and now Shocky is going to Okinawa. The major battle of Okinawa was over end of June. So Shocky is arriving in August. When they arrive, the kamikazes are still very active. They've taken out something like 268 ships in Okinawa. They're still coming over. In the Napalug, they record when they go to red alert in general quarters. 2200, 2400, 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Every night that they're there, there's no sleep. They're called to alarm, looking for the kamikazes. This is the landing. This is called Machinado Landing. I don't know if it's exactly Machinado. I think it is, but I never have been able to confirm that. So they're mostly landing supplies. I went to Okinawa and I took the pages from Napalog and I found a tour guide from Machinado, and I'm looking for these things that are in the book. So I said, can you show me Machinado Landing? And we could find, this is from the Napalog and this is the same hills. So one of my relatives said, why is it different distance? And I'm thinking, I don't know, because this is Machinado Landing and that's in the background. And I figured out, okay, this is where they were landing supplies, but where a Napa would be anchored was closer to that. So that's why that picture is closer, and this occurred to me. There you see them landing, and there you see again, from the Napa log, PA-157, landing barge 15, that's coming. This is what the tunnels look like in Okinawa. They would have looked very similar in Iwo Jima, but they were mostly destroyed. They had everything you can think of in their hospitals, training centers, conference rooms, bunks, everything inside those tunnels. When I was in Okinawa, I went to visit what they call the Peace Memorial Garden. The Okinawans have created a garden very much like the Vietnam Memorial. 250,000 names are on those walls. Every nationality of people that were killed in Okinawa are on those walls. And I have this page from Napalog, and it says, oh, I didn't tell you one story. I need to tell you. On one of those nights when they're called to general quarters, there is a young private who goes running to his position. Hold number 4 is open. He falls into hold number 4. He cracks his head, and an hour later he dies. And that next day they finish unloading, and they put BCF Schlebach ashore. He's given to the Army Grave Registration. He'd probably never been on Okinawa, but his body is given to them. And Shocky also would cry when he would tell this story, especially later in life he'd cry. So I thought, I should be able to find B.C. Schlebach on this wall because he died in Okinawa. And, oops. Okay, we missed the order here a little bit. As they are out in the harbor on the 6th of August, a plane leaves from Tinian, that famous airfield, goes overhead and bombs Hiroshima. That happens while they are still in Okinawa. Then B.C. Schlebach dies on the 7th. So that has already happened. 145,000 Japanese die in that bombing. So here's B.C. Schlebach. I found him on the wall, and I just broke into tears. It's like, I found a piece of my dad on the other side of the world, and I went circling around and went, go back there and go back there. But the Napalog is silent on where B.C. Schlebach was from. So my friends are telling me, you should contact the family. Tell them you saw this. But there's nowhere it says where he's from. But this spring, there is someone, I forget his name now, Jeff Hill, I think, who is filling in this missing information from World War II. And up pops B.C. Schlebach's photograph. This would be who Shocky was picturing. This guy would die about 7 days before the war ended. So it was very tragic. He was well liked. They called him Baby Boots. I don't know if he had small feet. I don't know. And many of the bodies buried on Japanese land were removed in the late 1940s. They came back in white ships with purple fabric draping them. And the families could choose Philippines, Punchbowl in Hawaii, State Cemetery, or Hometown Cemetery. So obviously, in that article that I could find now, B.C. Schlebach was brought back. He's buried in Nassau Cemetery, Round Rock, Texas. And if I had known this, my dad was in Dallas, I would have taken him there because it would have been a closing of a circle, but we didn't know that. And there's his tombstone. Even a letter is on the internet from the captain to his family, so it's very interesting. After that, Napa will go back to Saipan, and we've talked about Saipan. And that's the harbor. That's just an aerial picture. And again, there's no sign that the Japanese are going to surrender. So on the 9th of August, as they are in Saipan, a mile and a half away, plane takes off again. And this plane is going to Nagasaki. They called the bomb the Fat Man. It was a little bit different kind of a bomb, and it would kill 64,000 people. So I have a commentary on this, and I'm sure other people have other opinions, but this was a terrible thing. But the invasion of the home islands of Japan was planned for the 1st of November, 1945. The Americans were going in. The Japanese didn't surrender. The Japanese had 2 million troops on the home islands. They had 700 planes in reserve that would have been probably kamikazes. They were mining the beaches. And now we know the Japanese, even the civilians, would have been fighting. So Truman had very little choice. The estimate was we would have lost 1 million men, casualties and deaths, maybe more. So I believe really no choice about this. Now the Japanese military still did not want to surrender. They thought if they keep fighting, they will get better terms. And these bombings did not affect them. We didn't bomb military installations. We bombed cities, civilians. So they didn't want to surrender, but the emperor is wanting to open back door to Truman. At the Potsdam, I think it's the Potsdam Convention, they had said unconditional surrender, no conditions for Japan. That's it, unconditional. But he opened a back door and he wanted two things. He wanted to stay on his throne and he wanted no war trials for his family. And Truman basically agreed. He said if that's what the Japanese people want and if the occupying forces agree. So that would have been MacArthur. So they did review the emperor again, but he was given basically what he asked for. He asked for broadcast time. He went on Japanese radio, and they had never heard his voice because he was a god in Japan. They saw him as a god. He came on, and he didn't say surrender. He said to save civilization. And Japanese are surrendering. So August 15th, 1945 is what we call VJ Day, Victory over Japan. The famous photo in Times Square. The troops, many of the troops are crying, very excited because they now know they're very young and they will survive the war. Likely they will survive. And newspaper articles, war ends, Japan quits. Napa is sent to the Philippines. So this is the Philippines. That's where they are when the surrender happens. And on 2nd of September 1945, the USS Missouri pulls into Tokyo Bay. And Hirohito is the only surviving Axis power leader at this point. Hitler is dead, Mussolini is dead, and he still survives. He doesn't come to this. He sends his government people in tuxedos and top hats, and his generals in military uniform, and they sign first, and then MacArthur signs for the Army and the Allies, and Nimitz signs for the Navy and the Allies because they are dual command in the Pacific. The Americans are one of the only ones that fought on two fronts, dual command and still won. It's something you're not supposed to do, but they did. Shocky is still in the Philippines. No other city was bombed as much as Manila except Warsaw. Warsaw was bombed more. This is what Manila looked like. Everywhere that the ship goes, and it says this in the epilogue, they are always looking for souvenirs. There are no postcard shops. So they go scouting for carvings, burned out things to take home. And then on the 7th of September, Napa is called to Tokyo. So it says that the attack transports are the first ones to go into Tokyo Bay. They're bringing in occupation troops. And Napa log says this is the first time in the war that we had all of our lights on and there were friendly planes overhead. So Shocky goes into Yokohama was the harbor they went into. Tokyo's been bombed badly. This is what it looks like. We know that there was a typhoon while he was there. He was there about 12 days. And we know that some of the Navy crew, probably him and his friends, probably George Higgins and DeWitt T. Ray and Shocky, go aboard some of the abandoned, surrendered Japanese ships. And they're flying the black flag of surrender. They're sitting there in the harbor. And they take souvenirs. And they're allowed to do this. They need to write what they've taken. I don't think you would be allowed to do this anymore. They take souvenirs. And Shocky took this chest. I now have this chest. It's actually a Chinese chest. So it probably was owned by somebody who was in the occupation of China. This chest, another small chest, a Japanese gun, a piece of a Zero plane. He had these things always in this chest in our house, and you did not go in there. Not allowed. Because I'm sure we would have destroyed it all. I'm sure that the ship captain would have known this is coming aboard, and I'm sure they were bringing many things to take home. From there, Napa goes Guam. We talked about Guam, Saipan, and it's going to Qingdao. Qingdao, this is the German concession of China. Here's where they brew beer. You can still have Qingdao beer to this day. And they're going in there because Chiang Kai-shek is asking them to come because the Japanese troops need to be unarmed. In the outer areas, they have not surrendered. They still want to fight. The Japanese don't surrender in Qingdao until October at the race course, and the surrender happened in September. And from there, they will go to Manila back again, and they will go to Haiphong Harbor, which is basically North Vietnam. They will sit outside North Vietnam for quite a while, waiting for these guys. So they're there 3 weeks. And when they arrive, Shocky would describe these guys as the most ragtag, lice-infested group of guys. They are actually Kuomintang. They are Chiang Kai-shek's troops, and they're going to be evacuated from North Vietnam to Formosa, Taiwan. This is the start of the separation of Mao. I think the KMT is already starting to lose at this point, and Mao is taking over. The story he would tell about this is we didn't want them in our restrooms. We built plywood latrine for them. And the food would upset their stomachs, and it was a big mess, a big smelly mess. But one story he would tell is they would often show films on the deck. There must have been a flat area where they could show film. And they were showing a film, and the Chinese people came up to see this film, and they had never seen it before. And Shocky would say they were waving their hands in the air, trying to figure out where is this coming from, this image on the screen. And the next night he would laugh, and then the next night they thought there was going to be another movie. They came up again, and they were trying to figure that out. And then they would drop them in Formosa. Then the ship will go Manila, and it will get its first, what they call, magic carpet ride. So they are going to take troops back, troops that are done with the war. The ships will look something like this, fully loaded. And they will be fully loaded with casualties, too. And they will be taking them back to San Francisco. However, this is not Napa's magic carpet ride. They will go back out again. They're going back to Shanghai, and there's a distress call from a ship. And this ship is registered in Norway. It's called the Oregon Express, and a call goes out over the ship and says, does anybody on the ship speak Norwegian? And of course, that's going to be Shocky. Shocky spoke Norwegian before he spoke English. So he, in the landing barge with the medic, this ship pulls up close alongside, and they go over. Turns out that the ship's captain is on, or ship's wife is on board, and she's in a diabetic coma. And it doesn't say what happened. I'm sure they were able to resolve that, and they went on their way. And they will arrive in Shanghai. This is Napa sitting in Shanghai Harbor. And what Shocky would say about Shanghai is this was an awful place. There were dead babies floating in the water, probably baby girls because they didn't value them. There were kids with scabs all over them living under tarps on the docks because the Japanese would evacuate it, and the Civil War is starting again. The little boys on the docks would steal the sailors' wallets because they didn't have pockets. They just hung their wallets over their belts. And this is what the city looked like. This is the banking street. This is the Suzhou Creek loaded with boats. These are some of the pictures from Shanghai. I was going to mention Park Hotel. Napa Log does talk about the Park Hotel. And this was the tallest building in Shanghai at the time. And I think Shocky probably went there to the ballroom because many of them did, seek out that kind of entertainment. Park Hotel was always also my temporary quarters when I first moved to Shanghai. And I knew he had probably been there, but it had been renovated, so you couldn't really see what he saw, except the ballroom still existed up there. And Shocky would talk about these boats, the bum boats that would pull alongside the ship. And these guys would want to trade cigarettes and chocolate for anything, because there had been no cigarettes and chocolate in Shanghai for quite a long time. Shocky didn't smoke, but he did save the cigarettes to bargain. And he always loved Hershey bars. Hershey gave the troops a lot of Hershey bars, and so they had those to trade, and he ate Hershey bars all his life. And I figured that out too at one point. Oh, that's why you like Hershey bars. He also talks about the stories. He was to chaperone the troops going in to the city, and they were supposed to stay out of what was called no man's land, and this would be where the houses of ill repute were. And so he tells a story about, I went around the block, I chased them out, they're back in there again, I went around the block and chased them out. And then the madame finally says, you, free. Shocky goes, no. Because as soon as they went back to the ship, they had to go see the medic, and they were in trouble. Also this card. Shocky had this card in the chest, and you can see this is a tailor. I believe where he went was Love Lane. This was actually a restaurant street. I would go here too when I was in Shanghai, and this is where the Navy and Marines went. The Army went to Blood Alley, different place. There's a movie, John Wayne movie about Blood Alley. So I believe this is where he's telling that story from. This tailor is very near that location, so I kind of figured it out. You see the tailor wrote Shocky Hartwick Strand in Chinese for him, and Shanghai in Chinese. And then when we were in Hong Kong, he rode the rickshaws. Almost all the sailors, or the troops, did this. This is Shocky and DeWitt T. Ray riding the rickshaws. And when we went to Hong Kong, he spotted this in a store window, and we bought this because it reminded him of this. And this is his officer's commission mess from Shanghai. I never figured out exactly where that was, but I think it was the American Club, because they would have had kitchens and dining tables. And then Shocky's last stop in the Pacific would be Qingdao again. And you can see it's winter in Qingdao. This cartoon is from the Napa Log. They're obviously very chilly. And then they do get their magic carpet ride. They go back to San Diego. But Shocky and DeWitt T. Ray and George Higgins are not going to get off the ship in San Diego. They are told, you're going to take this ship through the Panama Canal over to Norfolk. And Dad said, I was so disappointed. But it was worth it in the end. So here are ships. Many ships went through the Panama Canal. This is the USS Iowa. Well, we don't have a picture of Napa, but that's what it looked like. And they would arrive in Norfolk. We had built up so many ships that this is what Norfolk looked like. Many ships of the same class chained together, stacked up there. And he would be in Norfolk in March. And then he says there are many jeeps in the harbor, lots of equipment and jeeps. There were keys in them. So when the officers were off duty, they would take these jeeps and see Washington, see Baltimore, see. So here's Shocky and DeWitt T. Ray at the White House, Shocky at the Capitol, Shocky at Mount Vernon. And we know on May 11th, 1946, he would go to Baltimore, to the Preakness Stakes, to Pimlico, and he would see this horse, Assault, who had also won the Kentucky Derby. He would win the Preakness. And the jockey, he said Murtaugh, but it was actually Mertens. And that horse would eventually also win the Belmont Stakes and would become a Triple Crown winner. Shocky was always a horseman. Even on the farm, he was one who drove horse, never tractor. So he's always into horse races. And this was probably the last day. This is George Higgins, this is Shocky. This is probably the last day they were on Napa. They were saying goodbye. It says Napa was decommissioned on the 30th, but Shocky might have gotten off a little bit earlier. And I think they're probably historically taking this photo. And Napa will be put in the James River Reserve, and it will exist there until September 17th, 1983.